Okay, so thank you, everyone. Thank you to the organizer for organizing this, I think, very exciting workshop. I think it's actually great to speak after Ulysses, because I think his talk is kind of related to what I'm going to talk about. So that's actually very good. I'm actually having some issues with I'm actually having some issue with internet. It says that my internet connection is unstable. So please let me know. Feel free to stop me if I go down. Okay, so what I'm going to do in this talk is to try to describe a problem related to the way that the so-called phenomenology-first approaches, or like IIT, for example, so namely approaches that start with phenomenology, with our experience looks like from the first-person perspective. So the problem is how these approaches fit the phenomenological data, right, the observations, with explanatory hypotheses of those data. Okay, so as I said, I will focus on IIT because it's famous. So we see that we all kind of know it, and I will use it as an example, a concrete example of the phenomenology-first approach. But I think that this problem that I'm going to talk about, I think, generalizes to other theories that might follow the same approach. So very briefly, the roadmap is this. So first, I will try to clarify the distinction between experiment-first and phenomenology-first approaches in consciousness science. Then I will show very briefly that experiment-first approaches hit a sort of roadblock, which might be methodological or conceptual. We'll try to figure out. Then I'll show that phenomenology-first approaches might have the potential to avoid that specific roadblock, but they have to face what I will call the self-evidencing problem. Okay, so just to start, where do we start from when we want to build a theory of consciousness, right? A scientific theory of consciousness? So I think that in the landscape of the neuroscience of consciousness, there are mainly two approaches to theory building. And these approaches differ with respect to the type of data that are considered relevant and fundamental for scientific practice. So the first one is kind of traditional. It's kind of, if you want, standard. It's based on an indirect access to phenomenology through reports, some sort of input-output function or stimulus response, behavioral measurements of some sort. So in this case, in this type of approach, the fundamental data are intersubjectively accessible, right? So the standard case is a sort of psychophysics type of experiment, sort of stimulus response scenario. And I think that if you want to build your theory of consciousness from this starting point, you are implying a sort of, at least a prima facie distinction between the data, the behavioral measurements, the reports, and so on, and the target phenomenon, the thing that we want to explain, consciousness. And this is actually quite standard in the natural sciences in general. If we follow a kind of a standard approach by James Bowen and James Woodward. So what we observe, the datum, is not the phenomenon, right? If we want to study temperature, we will measure, I don't know, mercury columns and so on, and then we trace back those observations to the phenomenon. Phenomenology-first approaches, on the other hand, are based on the idea that we can have a direct access to phenomenology, okay? So the data, the fundamental data on which we will build the theory of consciousness are accessible only to the subject of experience. And in this case, there is no distinction in consciousness science, and perhaps only in consciousness science, between the data, phenomenology, and the target phenomenon, okay? So what is directly observed, phenomenology, is the phenomenon that we want to explain. So this is a sort of revolutionary approach, and it's kind of interesting to ask why we should rely on this sort of revolutionary approach, because experiment-first approach, as I said, kind of methodologically continuous with the rest of natural sciences. So one might prefer them to the phenomenology-first approaches. But I think that there is a sort of data fitting issue here. So it is not clear how to reliably and accurately fit the data, the reports, the input functions, and so on that you gather through scientific experiment with a model of the phenomenon that we are actually interested in. I think the phenomenal overflow example, the debate is an example of this issue, right? So you have people like Deadlock saying that the data that you might gather to report are data about cognition, or let's say access consciousness or cognitive reportability, or however you want to call it. But they are not data about consciousness. They're not about the phenomenon that we're interested in. And there is some sort of, I don't know if it's a pessimism, but there's at least a skepticism that we can actually solve the debate from within this experiment-first approach. So this is Victor Lamme say the debate within theories that focus on phenomenal consciousness and those that focus on consciousness access seem to reach a stalemate. And Ian Phillips, not only do we not know whether consciousness requires cognition, we do not know how to find out. So here it seems kind of methodological, but I'm afraid that there might be something deeper going on. Perhaps there is like a deep conceptual disagreement on what consciousness is, right? Whether phenomenal consciousness is actually conceptually different than access consciousness or not. So perhaps there might be a way out of this impasse from within the experiment-first approach. Perhaps we can refine into measurements, do more science, and we will figure out. But here I want to focus on an alternative proposal, which I guess is the route that IIT proponents might take, which is to say something like that. Look, experiment-first approaches are fundamentally unable to deal with consciousness, with this particular phenomenon. So phenomenology-first approach is needed instead, okay? So phenomenology-first approaches seem to be well suited to make sense of this sort of epistemic asymmetry, right, that we have in consciousness, that is the most observable phenomenon of all from my own perspective, but it is also the most unobservable from a third person perspective. I think that's kind of the what Thomas Nagel pointed out in the famous Bath paper. So what I'm going to claim is that phenomenology-first approaches are actually not immune to data fitting issues. Okay? So it is not clear that they must be necessarily better than experiment-first approaches. And in this case, for the phenomenology-first approaches, the problem takes the form of what we call the self-evidencing problem. Okay? So very briefly, I will assume this is a matter of debate. I think a very interesting debate, actually. I will assume that phenomenology-first approaches are scientifically legitimate. So that's an actual open question, but the question that I want, the specific question that I want to focus on here is this: is the phenomenology-first approach successful in explaining consciousness? And now let's focus on specifically on IIT to see how it might work. So in IIT, very briefly, just to make sure that everyone is on board, you have this phenomenology, like consciousness is organized in axioms, and then it is operationalized, kind of translated into scientific terms, courtesy of these postulates, right? So that the axioms are supposed to pick out the essential features of consciousness. The postulates are supposed to kind of explain how the physical world should be in order to underpin, to constitute the phenomenological feature picked out by the axioms. Okay. Then the postulates are formulated in sort of information theoretic terms, so that phenomenology can operationalize in formal terms and quantitatively measure. So we have this phi max, which is the measure of integrated information. according to the theory, consciousness is integrated information, and therefore phi max is the measure of consciousness. Okay. So, IIT proponents might say that contrary to experiment-first approaches, IIT doesn't risk measuring something other than consciousness because phi max is just extracted, right? It's just derived from consciousness itself. So we can build a theory of consciousness without the need for a report or input-output functions and so on. The good thing is that we don't bring confounding factors into the data that we use to build the theory, because the data are purely phenomenological. Okay. But I think there is a big but here. For phi max, in this case, to be a measure of consciousness, right, we need to make sure that the path that goes from phenomenology to its operationalization is the correct one. In the case of IIT, this means that the self-evident truths about phenomenology, which are the axioms, must be conserved in the non-self-evident terms through which postulates are formed. So a question, I guess, here is what is the logic fueling the inference from axiom to postulates? And I think that IIT proponents might want to suggest that it is a sort of abduction, right? Sort of inference to the best explanation. So the postulates will be the best explanation of the axiom. Each single postulate will be the best explanation of each single axiom. There is an open debate on whether abduction itself is actually truth conducive. You have a Bas-Frassen argument that being the best of a bad lot doesn't make you good. If you follow Italian politics, you might relate to that argument. But anyway, in this case, I will just assume that it is truth conducive. Abduction is truth conducive. I want to kind of concede as many things as possible to IIT or to phenomenology-first approaches, and then show that you still have, I think, a problem. So you have this sort of circle in IIT. So you have the axiom, start with the axiom. For example, consciousness is unified, is integrated, as so earlier in Ulysses' talk. This kind of provides evidence, kind of forces you to believe in the truth of the postulate, namely that the physical subset of consciousness is integrated, right? So it is a physical mechanism that specifies a cause-effect repertoire that is irreducible to independent components. And in turn, this would explain why consciousness is unified, why I have observed like my phenomenology being the way it is. So we have this fact here that the only evidence that the postulate is true is given by one's own phenomenology, together with, I guess, the assumption that a mind independent world exists like the physical world actually exists. But phenomenology, right, which is the only thing that provides evidence, provides support to the postulate, is the thing that we want to explain. And philosophers of science came up with this idea of self-evidencing explanation to kind of model this sort of cases, which is basically just this. This is how Karl Hempel introduced the term in his book. Self-evidencing explanations occur when the information that the explanandum event, the thing that you want to explain, has occurred. That information is part of the only available evidential support for its explaners, right? For the thing that does the explanation. So it's actually easier than it sounds. This is the example due to Peter Lipton. If you observe a footprint on the ground out of your window, you might hypothesize that there is a burglar around, right? So the observation is the only piece of evidence available to provide support for the hypothesis that there is a burglar around, which, if it is true that there is a burglar around, that would explain why the footprint occurred, right? So you have this sort of evidential explanatory circle that you see kind of maps what we have seen in IIT, right? Observation provides evidence for the hypothesis that in turn explains the observation. So this type of explanation is sort of bootstrapping explanatory processes, right? And seems kind of possible for phenomenology-first approaches to use this type of explanation, right? Because I think the aim of the phenomenology-first approach is try to bootstrap the explanation of consciousness from consciousness itself, right? So it seems that they can fit together in a sense, right? And the interesting point here is that these explanations are circular, so they are circular, but the circularity can be illuminating, and they are a legitimate tool that scientists use. Here is an example from astronomy. Again, this is due to Carl Hempel. So let's say you observe this redshift in the absorption spectrum of a star, right? You see this dark line representing like the wavelength of the starlight or something like that, shifting towards the red end of the spectrum. And together with what you know about the Doppler effect, laws of optics in general, that provides evidence for the fact that the star is receding. If it is true that the star is receding, that would explain why the redshift occurred, right? So this is just to say that it's something that it is used in science, and it is kind of accepted as valid in science, this type of reason. We have two problems here, though. The first problem is that self-evidencing circles can turn vicious. And the second one is that when they are powered by an abductive logic, it seems to be the case in IIT, they also need to provide evidence for only one explanatory hypothesis, namely the best one, right? Why is it not working here? Okay. So if IIT's postulate want to be successful self-evidencing explanations of the corresponding axiom, well, they need to meet these two criteria, right? They must not give rise to vicious circularity, and they must provide evidence for only one explanatory hypothesis. And they argue that the problem with IIT consists in the second criteria. Very briefly, let's see why I don't think that the vicious circularity is a problem for IIT. So how could a self-evidencing explanation turn vicious? Well, let's go back to the burglar example. Imagine someone raises doubts about the occurrence of the evidence. And says that what you took to be a burglar's footprint is in fact the trace left by a flower pot, like a foot-shaped flower pot that has been recently moved from its spot, something like that. How can I dismiss this alternative hypothesis, right? If I say that it can be right because there is a burglar around, well, then the circularity turns vicious, right? Because I believe in the burglar's hypothesis only in virtue of the observation of the footprint, right? So if I want to dismiss the doubts about the occurrence of the evidence, about the occurrence of the footprint, I have to rely on good reasons to believe in the burglar hypothesis, and these good reasons must be based on considerations that are external to the evidentiary circle, meaning they have to be independent on the occurrence of the evidence, right? And the hypothesis that the burglar is around is not independent on the footprint, on the occurrence of the footprint. So you might rely on like criminality rate in your suburb or something like that. So I don't think this is a problem for IIT because, first of all, doubts about the occurrence of the evidence cannot raise by definition if axioms are self-evident truths, you know, and I am the only authority here, right? It's my phenomenology. So you can't raise doubts about my own phenomenology. Let's say that you can in the way that Tim Bain did in the 2018 paper. Perhaps you might want to say that a particular property is not an essential property of consciousness, right? So it can be an axiom. But IIT doesn't dismiss these doubts by appealing to the postulates. Right? It doesn't say that my consciousness is unified because my physical structure is integrated or something like that. Right? It tries to dismiss these doubts through phenomenological consideration, which might succeed, might not. You might not be particularly convinced by the move. But the point here is that the circularity doesn't seem to turn vicious. The strategy used by IT doesn't necessarily turn vicious. I think the problem is in the second criterion. So IIT here needs to provide reason to believe that the chosen postulate is in fact the best one, right? It's only one and maybe the best. And in order to do this, we need background assumptions and background knowledge, right? So this is Stathis Psillos writing an IBE inference to the best explanation type of reasoning as a fine structure that is shaped by and large by the context. So explanations are by and large detailed stories. The background knowledge ranks the competitors, and other background assumptions determine the part of the logical space that we look for competitors. I think that's a very important point here, because we can imagine this situation, this scenario. So we have the integration axiom. Let's say that we agree that consciousness is unified. We might come up with an alternative explanation, right? An alternative integration postulate saying that mechanisms can contribute to consciousness only if the information it generates is broadcast into a global module that spatiotemporally binds the information coming from different submodules, right? So this is just a toy example, right? I don't want to explore this, but just a toy example to say that at least it seems plausible to come up with other explanation for the same property, even if we agree that consciousness is always unified, right? So in the burglar example, as well, there might be several hypotheses that can explain the observation, right? The flower pot, maybe someone pulled a prank, maybe someone was climbing the roof to repair, you know. And there are a lot of different hypotheses that can explain the observation. And the consideration I use to justify why the burglar hypothesis is the best one are considerations external to the self-evidencing circle, right? Perhaps I assume that no one in their sane mind would ever buy a foot-shaped flower pot. I might assume that no one would ever pull a prank like that to me, something like that, right? And that kind of restricts the so-called logical space for competitors, right? And the problem in IIT is that it is not clear. I don't think it's clear what this background knowledge and assumptions amount to. Right? So without knowing the background knowledge, background assumptions behind the axiom to postulate translation, we can't really tell whether the self-evidencing dynamics generated by the inference from axiom to postulates are successful. Right? And I think this is what I call the self-evidencing problem, right? We don't know if perhaps the axioms are self-evident, but the postulates might not be self-evidencing, right? Just to clarify, the problem is not that the postulates are not. The problem is that we do not have enough information to evaluate whether they are or not. So perhaps something like pandispositionalism, you know, a sort of ontological stance that tells you that the physical world must be described in causal terms, in terms of causal powers. That might work as background assumption, right? That would explain why the postulates are formulated in cause-effect power terms. But that would help determine just the logical space we look for competitors. We would know that the postulates must be formulated in cause-effect power terms, but that wouldn't help rank the competitors. So it might be necessary, but not sufficient to solve the self-evidencing problem. Okay, to conclude, the self-evidencing problem, I think, generalizes to other phenomenology-first approaches. So if you want to explain consciousness from consciousness itself, you can exploit this type of explanation, the self-evidencing explanation. But for this type of explanation to work, the circularity must be illuminating, must not turn vicious, and must guarantee that phenomenological evidence supports the best operationalization in scientific. I think that the problem arises anytime one of these criteria is not met. So phenomenology-first approaches might escape the particular data-fitting issue that created the impasse in the case of experiment-first approaches. but they have to face a similar issue related to how phenomenological data are mapped onto physical operationalization. So unless the self-referencing problem is solved, phenomenology-first approaches cannot really claim superiority over experiment-first approaches with respect to how we build a theory in consciousness science. And that's it. If you want to read the paper or if you have further comments or questions, feel free to reach out at this email. I'm always happy to chat. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.